after a nice tasty meal. Okay, so I'd like to thank the SSE and IRVA Program Committee for inviting me to come and give this talk, and I'd like to dedicate this talk to Betty Barron. All right, so how many of you know your astrological sign? Show of hands. All right, good. How many of you are Leos? Let's see all the Leos. We should have about a 12th of you. Come on, all right. How many of you have seen these sorts of things? Newspapers, your daily horoscope. Okay. How many of you think this is a science? I see one person with their hand up, a couple of people with hands up. Do you think that's science? Good. All right. Well, the National Science Board thinks it's pseudoscience. The National Science Board every year does a science and engineering indicator. You can find these on the National Science Foundation's website, and they do a number of surveys and other measures every year to determine the knowledge about science and engineering in the American population. And they cite one measure of Americans' views on whether astrology is scientific has been included since the 1970s, and they say that astrology, along with belief in lucky numbers and extrasensory perception and magnetic therapy and other things, are examples of pseudoscience. So, and they ought to know they're the National Science Board. So, if you believe in telekinesis, raise my hand. How many people are interested in cryptozoology? I see cryptozoologists in the crowd. Okay, how many people are interested in ESP and remote viewing? I expect to see a fair number of remote viewing people in the crowd. Okay, psychokinesis, psychokinetic phenomena. Look at all this. Good, here we are. UFOs, where are the UFO people? All right. Remote viewing, we've got the remote viewing crowd here. Good, all right, so are these good representations of these disciplines as you think of them when you see these kinds of representations? Or do you think that your discipline is having a little more substance to it than these kind of pop culture representations? So a few years ago, Bill Bengston, our president, presented a talk at our SSE meeting in 2012. Bill had surveyed SSE members and had a really good response rate for a survey. 428 of our members responded to this survey, and they were asked to rank 10 phenomena that we like to talk about in the society in terms of how much acceptance they have, as to whether they had high confidence in them or whether they had some confidence, some degree of skepticism, or a high degree of skepticism on this Likert scale. And astrology came out as number 10, or as I like to think of it, we're number 1. We're the most skeptically skeptical of the disciplines here. And you can see here, general psi came out on top with this survey. Remote viewing was right in the middle in terms of the level of acceptance among our members in the SSE. And these are all phenomena that have had plenty of talks. PAIR is the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, for those of you who are not familiar with what PAIR is. He also asked people to rank their level of knowledge. How much knowledge did each of the members feel they had about those disciplines? And you'll see a pretty strong correlation between the level of knowledge and the acceptance rank in this data. Again, the majority of people ranked their knowledge of general psi as most highly, and their knowledge of astrology was ranked rather low. They were also asked their understanding of published work on that particular topic, and again, you can see a tie on out-of-body experiences and remote viewing for 3rd and 4th place. Again, astrology, the familiarity with published work was ranked at number 9. How much they based their rating on a credible authority, not clear however people would have defined that as a credible authority. And again, a pretty strong correlation here between the acceptance of the phenomenon and the knowledge from a credible authority. And then finally, they were asked to rank it based on personal experience rank. The one piece that's interesting in here is that personal experience is ranked as number 5. I'm not clear, but since all of you seem to know your sun signs, maybe that qualified as a personal experience. How many of you have actually had a consultation with an astrologer? Well, there's a fair number of you here. Oh, that's pretty good. Okay. So we're going to talk not about the sun sign astrology in the newspapers, but we're going to talk about astrology as practiced by counseling astrologers. So first off, we'll start with a brief, very brief history of Western astrology. There's a long history of astrology around the world, but I'm just going to concentrate on Western astrology for the purpose of this talk and a very brief history. And this history goes back 35,000 to 30,000 BCE with some of the earliest archaeological artifacts, finding bones with 29 notches that correspond to the synodic month, the new moon cycle, and representations of the various constellations in cave paintings. By 5,000 to 3,000 BCE, we start to find megalithic constructions, large, monuments that are pretty well accepted by the scientific community as being used to predict the alignment of various astronomical phenomena. By the time we get to 3,000 to 1,000 BCE, we start to find cuneiform tablets that not only show astronomical phenomena, but begin to describe meaning to these astronomical phenomena. So this could possibly be denoted as the beginning of astrology as we might think of it. And by 2000 to 1000 BCE, with Egyptian astrology, we find specific references to the constellations as a reference point for planetary positions. By the time we get to 1000, about 100 Common Era, with the Greeks adapted Babylonian astrology and they began to integrate it into a larger philosophical framework. Plato thought of the stars and planets as representing the world's soul or a universal intelligence, and integrated this into a rationalized Pythagorean system, elements of fire, earth, air, and water, which are still part of an astrological tradition today. And Aristotle thought of God as the prime mover, and that the planets were not causes, but they were secondary causes, and they were a way of translating the will of the prime mover to beings on Earth. Ptolemy is often considered the father of the tropical zodiac, which is a way of measuring, again, the positions of the planets defined by the spring equinox rather than the constellations. The ancients were aware of the precession of the equinoxes, and they still defined at this point reference from the first day of spring. And Ptolemy also described motions in terms of epicycles, because in this Platonic system, the Earth was the center of the universe. Everything revolved around the Earth, and in order to explain the motions and the apparent backward motion of planets from our perspective, the Ptolemaic system created a series of epicycles as a way of describing these. So we still start to see, again, a theoretic framework that was being developed to describe the motions. With the advent of Christianity, the Star of Bethlehem and the Magi is a pretty well-known story, that the Magi are pretty well considered to have been astrologers and followed an astronomical phenomena predicting the birth of Jesus. In the New Testament, however, we find no condemnation of astrology. There's really not much discussion of astrology per se in the New Testament. But as Christianity developed and the doctrines began to be developed, St. Augustine developed the doctrine of original sin and the concept that you had to have free will, and free will was a necessity for salvation. And because of that idea, by the 4th century, the church prohibited astrology because they felt that the future was unknowable, and again, that you needed to have free will in order to find salvation. You had to accept Jesus in order to be saved. By the Middle Ages, the Arabs were translating Greek astrology, and then Latin scholars in turn translated those Arabic translations so to recover some of this lost material. And we find people like Roger Bacon and Thomas Aquinas who accepted natural astrology, again, distinguishing that from the soul, but talking about the impacts of astrology in relation to medicine, alchemy, meteorology, and other more natural phenomena here. By the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, there was the rediscovery of Greek philosophy and the sort of the beginnings of what we start to think of as science. We have refinements that the Ptolemaic system, enough observations to begin to determine that this constant adding of epicycles wasn't an adequate way to predict the motions of the planets. The Copernican revolution, which then moved the center of the solar system to the sun away from the Earth. Kepler's laws of planetary motion, which now describe the planetary motions in terms of ellipses rather than perfect circles, moving away from the Platonic ideals. And the scientific revolution occurred, and we find this split with the scientific revelation. Science got the physical domain, and religion got the spiritual domain, and astrology was sort of left in the middle to be rejected and condemned by both of these camps. So that's, again, a very brief history of the sort of background of astrology. As you can see, it is probably the oldest cultural phenomena that we have as a species. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the astronomy of astrology. Some of you have seen an astrologer, may have some understanding of this, but I don't want to make any assumptions about what we're talking about here. So we start off with a view of the solar system, which you've probably all seen. We've got the sun in the middle, and we've got the orbiting Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, etc., which are orbiting the sun. So that's the phenomena that we're actually trying to represent here. And there's a number of ways of representing this astronomically that have nothing to do with astrology. And the usual way of doing this is with this representation of the celestial sphere. And so here we see in the celestial sphere, the sun and the Earth orbits around the sun. You see the tilt of the Earth's axis, which is tilted with respect to the sun, and the Earth, of course, rotates on its axis every 24 hours, which is what causes the days. The Earth revolves around the sun, and we have the ecliptic defined by that plane, which is a metric for measuring not only the locations of the sun, but the moon and other planets. And so that describes the motion of the Earth and the other planets similarly in that ecliptic plane. As I said, though, of course, we all know the Earth rotates on its axis, and so, well, before we talk about that, first we'll go to location of the planets in the zodiac. So from the Earth's perspective, when we are on the Earth and we look at, say, the sun, we look past the sun, and in the background we see the constellations, and so that's the zodiac that is the reference point. So as the Earth revolves around the sun, the apparent motion of the sun is, and the other planets, is through the zodiacal constellations. So when we talk about planets being in a particular sign, those signs originally were aligned with the constellations. Due to the precession of the equinox, that alignment is moved, but we still use those names for the signs. Getting back to being on the planet Earth here, as we stand on the planet Earth and look at the celestial sphere, as we look north, we see the sun and other planets all appear to rise in the east, culminate overhead at roughly noon, and set in the west. And so we're familiar with that phenomena with the sun because it's obvious, but all the planets appear to rotate, rise and set throughout the day with the daily motion of the Earth. And so the representation of that in a horoscope is captured in this phenomena here. So here we have a horoscope set for the 22nd of April, 2014 in Manchester, England. This has been animated to show the motions as the time progresses throughout the day. And so the eastern horizon is represented here. So we can see at this point that Sagittarius is rising at this particular time. The planets move, as I said, throughout the day. So we have Mars up here. Each of these glyphs represents a planet. That's Saturn down there. We have Pluto over here, we have the moon. These are moving around. The daily motion of these planets rising and setting around the Earth every 24 hours. We see the locations of the planets in their zodiacal signs indicated here. So as an example, Jupiter is in Cancer there. Sun is in Taurus down here. There are angular aspects that are measured between these planets, and so in this particular representation, these blue lines with triangles represent angular relationships of approximately 120 degrees, or called trines. These lines here represent oppositions, about 180 degrees apart. And this line here represents a square, about 9 degrees apart, and there is astrological meaning assigned to each of these aspects. And as I said, you can see now here in about the 4 or 5 hours of animation that we've been watching here, the planets have moved quite a bit through the diurnal cycle. These wedges here that are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4 are the houses. And these houses, you'll notice the different sizes of these houses. That's because Manchester, England is very far north. So these house positions are, the size of those houses varies depending on the time of day and the latitude. More extreme northern latitudes have these wide houses. So now you can see the 12th house is rather wide in this particular chart by 6 o'clock in the morning. So that's the frame of reference that an astrologer is using when interpreting a horoscope. This is the representation. Okay, we'll push the button, there we go. So that's the mechanics of it, but there's astrological interpretation. Astrology is all about the meaning, and astrologos translates fairly loosely to star language. And an astrologer who is working with a client uses all of these various symbols and assigns meaning to those symbols to interpret them in the context of a person. So for every person that the client meets, they cast a horoscope for the time, place, and location of the time and location of birth to get that chart, and then interpret the positions based on those positions, but based on that astrological chart. And in this interpretation, the planets can loosely be thought of as verbs or translating to drives or energies. The signs can be thought of as adverbs, how the planets are expressed. So the sun in Taurus is interpreted differently than the sun in Leo, as an example. The houses are adverbs in the area of life in which it's expressed. So in this case, the sun is in Taurus in the 5th house, and that would be often attributed to children and creativity. But if the sun were in the 10th house, it would be attributed to career and public persona. The ascendant, which again varies every 2 hours or so based on time of birth, is usually another key component of the horoscope. In this case, this ascendant is in Scorpio, and it has Saturn on the ascendant in the 12th house. So that could be considered a malefic position by many astrologers. And then finally, again, these aspects either strengthen or weaken the positions. A trine is considered a beneficial aspect. It makes a harmonious relationship between the planets. A square is considered disharmonious and a tension aspect. And so the key to an astrological interpretation is to combine all of these elements into a story and a reading for a particular person to assess personality and other traits and characteristics. There's a whole lot of other complexity that can be added to this. You can now look at the movements of the planets as they are at the moment. They're called transits, and these things are used to indicate timing. And so oftentimes if talking about astrology and they talk about what would be coming up in the next year, they would be using those kinds of transits to make those predictions. So that's a rough introduction to the mechanics and interpretation of astrology. And so back to the original title here, so is astrology science, pseudoscience, or something else? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the scientific evidence for astrology. And in this case, this is scientific evidence for what we would think of as natal astrology, the relationship of these planetary positions to personalities and human behavior. So in terms of research on human behavior, there's 3 types of astrological research. Broadly, we can categorize these as tests of astrologers. That is, this is what astrologers claim they can do, so we're going to try to evaluate whether they can do it or not. Comparisons of astrological factors with psychological inventories. That's a fairly popular thing in the 20th century with the advent of psychology. Psychology claims to do that which astrologers are claiming to do, be able to characterize people's behavior and motives. And so there are tests that compare astrology to psychological factors. And then finally, comparisons of astrological factors with something that one might call an objective behavior is a 3rd type of test. So in terms of tests of astrologers, some of the best known tests of astrologers were conducted by Vernon Clark in the 60s and I think 70s. And there are three pretty well-known tests that Clark did. The first of which, all of these use experienced astrologers as their test subjects. And in the first test, the astrologers were given charts of 5 males and 5 females, and they were asked to match the charts to the people based on descriptions of their occupations. They varied in ages from 45 to 65, so they were all fairly experienced in whatever occupation they had. And they all had accurate birth times, and we'll talk about the importance of accurate birth times, but to do a horoscope, you do need an accurate birth time. In this case, the astrologers were able to perform fairly well. On average, 6.4 out of 10 of these charts were matched correctly. The odds of that are p to less than 10 to the minus 7th, so they did a pretty good job with that one. In the second test, astrologers were given 10 charts to match against 10 case histories. And these are written case histories. They were not actually interacting with the clients in any of these cases. They had to identify a true chart from a randomly generated control. So for each of the 10 case histories, they had a pair of charts, or authentic chart, and a randomly generated false chart. And there they were able to perform pretty well, 7.2 out of 10, p to the minus 10 to the minus 9th. In the third test, they were given 10 pairs of charts, and in these cases, they were all authentic charts. One chart was a subject that had cerebral palsy, a severe mental debility, and the other chart was a subject that had high intelligence, and they were asked to identify which was which in each of these 10 pairs. Here they didn't perform quite as well, 5.9 out of 10, but it's still statistically significant, p less than 0.002. So there's several problems with these matching experiments. The first are that there are several hidden clues. The dates or ages of an experienced astrologer, even without the date, by looking at a horoscope, can pretty well identify what date it was done because they know where the planets are if they've done enough horoscopes. The self-descriptions can be influenced by knowledge of astrology, and we'll talk about that a little more. There's other instances of that impacting research. And there are some statistical and sampling challenges here. We have a few charts and a large number of astrologers, and the particulars of the charts that were selected could have a substantial impact on the outcome. And a lot of criticism of these tests suggests that it would be better to use a large number of charts and a smaller number of astrologers. But of course, that's an exhausting task to ask somebody to do hundreds of charts and to compare and match them. And the second type of test, astrology, is compared to psychological inventories. And the subjects for psychological inventories ask a series of questions with which they usually strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and then these questions are used to characterize their personalities. And there's several of these kinds of tests: the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, the Isaac Personality Inventory, the California Personality Inventory, the 16 Personality Factor. There's a bunch of these things that are out there. And one of the earliest of these tests was done by Mayo, White, and Isink, and Isink is the Isink of the Isink Personality Inventory, so he was involved in this test. He was not an astrologer, but was very interested in the possibility of confirming the utility of his personality inventory. And the hypothesis here was that extroversion and introversion, which are one of the scales on the EPI, would correlate with alternating sun signs, that Aries is extroverted, Taurus is introverted, Gemini is extroverted, and so forth. And in this case, they found a very strong support for this hypothesis, p less than 0.001. And this test was replicated by other people. And so this was considered a fairly significant result at the time that it happened. However, subsequent research revealed that the subjects had some knowledge of astrology, and that confounded the results. And it only required a modest knowledge of sun sign traits. And so you all, as an example, indicated you know your sun signs. You probably have some idea of what those traits that are associated with those sun signs are. And the point was that that indicated just having that knowledge alone was enough to impact the results, which is probably more of a condemnation of the personality inventory than of astrology at that point. One of the more famous tests that was done of comparing astrology to personality inventory was done by Sean Carlson, and it was published in Nature in 1985. And one thing to keep in mind, it was published as a commentary in Nature, so it was not peer-reviewed. But in this test, astrologers were asked to interpret subjects' horoscopes and then prepare a written interpretation of those horoscopes, and then each subject took the California Personality Inventory. And the subjects were asked to then pick their horoscope from one of three, pick out the one that describes you, and they were unable to do that at a statistically significant level. They were also unable to select their own CPI description from among the three. And astrologers were unable to match their horoscope to any of the three CPI profiles in that test. So that was considered a refutation of astrology, and has been well publicized in the skeptical community. And that has that stood the test of time until not too long ago, when Sweetbart Urtel did an interesting reanalysis of this test. And so among the criticisms of this test that had been voiced before was that the California Personality Inventory has very poor psychometrics. Technical details about the way in which the CPI was developed, but it's actually a critique of the CPI itself. And the other major critique is that the subjects and astrologers themselves are not trained in the CPI, and the manual for the CPI is very clear that you have to be trained in order to be able to do an interpretation of the CPI. The data analysis is also a three-way comparison versus a two-way comparison. So the correct statistical comparison should be pick your correct one from among the three, not a 1 out of 3, but it's, you got right versus wrong is the way in which that should be compared statistically. And it also had a very low test power because of the small n. There was a small number of participants, and there were no effect size calculations. But when Urtel reanalyzed these data, they actually, with the binomial test, had a very modest effect size of 0.1 to 0.5. So in that sense, in Carlson's own data, Urtel showed that there actually was a positive result. So we'll move on from tests of personality inventories to tests of objective behavior. And in this case, we talk about the dependent variable being some behavior or trait that's defined on a non-astrological basis. And the independent variable is one or more astrological factors. And the way in which you determine whether this works or not is by measuring the statistical deviation from chance. The best known of this work is done by Michel and Françoise Gauquelin in the 1950s all the way up through the 90s when, with their respective deaths. And the Gauquelin research, basically, they had three major thrusts of their research. One was to look at at eminent professionals in a variety of professions, sports champions, military, and physicians, a number of other professions. They looked at the relationships and heredity between parents and children. This is some of their less known work. And then they also looked at various character traits. And in the Gauquelin's own research, they found no evidence for astrological signs. They found no evidence for aspects, but they did find evidence for planets rising and culminating in that daily motion that we showed you earlier. And that's fairly strong evidence. We'll talk about that in a moment. So going back to this representation of a horoscope here with the eastern horizon here and the planets rising, culminating, and setting, the Gauquelins basically are using house divisions, but they numbered them clockwise instead of counterclockwise. And what are called the Gauquelin plus zones start just before the rising up through about what would be considered the 12th house in standard astrology, and just before culminating through what would be considered the 9th house in standard astrology as the primary Gauquelin plus zones. And in those zones, the Mars sports champion data are the best known, and these are the data of sports champions where Mars is rising and culminating much more frequently than expected by chance. The inner circle represents the expected frequency, and so you see a surplus of Mars rising and surplus of Mars culminating much more frequently than expected by chance. Now this result, oh no way, 5 minutes. It says here I've only been going 30. Okay, well, I guess we have to move it on here. All right, so the Gauquelin professions, several planets, these align with traditional astrological interpretation, but rising and culminating does not. And the Gauquelin key findings are that this effect increases with eminence and that children tend to be born with planets in the same sector as their parents. Okay, but there was a great controversy with this data. And the Belgian committee first analyzed that data in 1968, replicating the results and refusing to publish for 8 years, challenging their expected frequency calculations. Objections to astrology. This is the actual beginning document for the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. The Zelen test of expected frequencies, in which they matched ordinary births, confirmed the results, but Psychop failed to acknowledge that, and the star baby was the beginning of this controversy. That controversy has been well documented by Sweetbird Ertel and Kenneth Irving. Kenneth is here. If you wanted more questions about this, he'd be happy to talk with you, I'm sure. They uncovered this eminence effect in the skeptics' data, showing how the skeptics had fudged their own data in order to overcome the astrology. The Gauquelin effect size has got a large N, but with 435 sports champions having Mars rising, you expect 358. It's very significant, but it's really a very small effect size. So you can't really use it in practice. It doesn't do you very good. If I see Mars rising, I can't predict you're going to be a sports champion. And it's a similar effect size to psi phenomena, and that's an interesting piece that we'll get back to shortly, I hope, if I don't run out of time. So there's several methodological challenges with this work here. Astrology has a lot of research problems. These effects are subtle. We compare expected to observe values, and the control procedures are usually where astrology research fails, for failure to have adequate controls. There's a number of astronomical factors, planet position interactions, demographic factors that impact these things. One of the more interesting ones is induced births. The Gauquelins found that these effects go away with induced birth, and currently in the US, 40% of births are induced, which makes astrological research extremely challenging. And as I mentioned, controls groups are very important. I'm going to skip these pieces here because I want to get to the end here, so I apologize. My time and your time are not the same, Paul, so I guess we're in different time zones. Okay. Let's see. So in univariate analyses, we're doing one of these things one at a time. But in multivariate analysis, we can compare more than 2 variables at once. And so here, if we're comparing 2 variables on 2 different things, we measure them and then we do it again for another variable, and we do them one at a time. But we can actually, astrological interpretation is an integration of all of these variables, and so that's a key piece here. And multivariate analysis is a way of doing that. And so we can flip this axis and map the individual components, and now we look at the correlations and covariances of our variables and use that for multivariate analysis. I've done a couple of these tests with discriminant analysis, one comparing Alcoholics Anonymous members to control groups, and we were able to correctly classify people as AA members or not with pretty high statistical power, and also attempted to differentiate 8 of the Gauquelin professions using that test. Randomly, we would be able to do this 12.5% of the time. On the first test, 19%, and the second test, 16%. Again, very good statistical power here. So, astrologers do synthesize variables, but we think the multivariate techniques might be a better way to model that, and that does provide much higher resolution and a much more authentic test. So, back to the original question, is this science, pseudoscience, or an anomaly? Well, science is a study of a body of facts or truths. We can call it a discipline like chemistry or physics, but it's also a systematic, it's a procedure for studying the physical and material world. And in normal science, according to Thomas Kuhn, when finding previously unpredicted phenomena, we show how that phenomenon is explained with an existing paradigm, But in pseudoscience, we have a number of phenomena here that are outside of the bounds of normal science because they fall outside of our existing theories. And so rather than just trying to deal with those anomalies, often the label of pseudoscience is applied to that, but it really is more of a pejorative term than a technical definition. And in Kuhn's thinking, anomalies violate paradigms and induce a crisis in science until you can come up with a new paradigm that would explain those phenomena. And so the goal of scientific revolutions, as far as Kuhn is concerned, is to move paradigms forward, and that's what we think astrology and many of these other phenomena represent, those anomalies, and the reason that they're rejected by science is because they do violate those paradigms and makes it difficult for scientists to conduct normal science as we usually have. So with that, I'd like to, again, we have no known mechanism in astrology. There's a phenomena there. It's amenable to scientific research. We have strong statistical evidence, but we have small effect size. Again, like we have with many other of the phenomena that are investigated here in SSE and IRVA, well below the claims of practitioners. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions. Yes.
Okay, there it goes.
There we are. You may be familiar with the name of Jeffrey Armstrong, a Vedic astrologer. I'm sure you're familiar with the name Michael Shermer.
Right.
Well, Michael Shermer had a program called Exploring the Unknown, where he invited astrologers to come on so we could show how silly they were. It turned out, though, after he did this investigation, the typical thing where you swap the real astrology reading with someone else's, and then you do a comparative analysis, it turned out that it came out 77% accuracy on the part of Jeff Armstrong.
Okay.
So I guess the question is, what about a Vedic astrology? It seems to be much more accurate. The other thing is, how did Michael Shermer allow that to?
I'm sorry, the last...
Yeah, I'm cutting out. How in the world did Michael Shermer, the famous skeptic, allow that to go through? You actually can find it on the internet,
Right.
And Michael Shermer does make a fairly weak argument about he didn't have enough time to debunk it, but the science showed otherwise.
Sure. Again, in answer to your first question, there are several schools of astrology. Obviously, I didn't have time to begin to scratch the surface here. Different frameworks for interpretation. I wouldn't begin to, there are strong debates between the two schools. I wouldn't begin to get involved in that debate. And I guess I would say good to Michael Shermer for not burying a positive result. Hi, Steve.
Hi. Mark, as you know, my spousal unit is a gifted astrologer.
Yes.
And Gina's contention is that most astrologers don't know how to correct for time of birth, that the correct time of birth is the one where the major events in a person's life fall out on the chart where they should.
Right.
So perhaps if this astrologers being tested knew how to correct for time of birth, the effect wouldn't be so small.
That's again, you're talking about what's called rectification, where you use event timing to adjust the time of birth. There's several ways of doing that. Of course, that becomes a challenge now because have you basically corrected the chart for research purposes? Have you corrected the horoscope to align with the research results? That would, it's a thing that an individual astrologer does with a client.
Just to let you know, Mark, because we had some tech issues early on, you got started a little late, so I'm going to comp you a few minutes and I'll get forgiveness from Garrett later.
Well, good, okay. Sorry for rushing through. I'd be happy to review anything that was too fast at the end, sorry. Anyway, hi York.
Hi. I'd like to say that for me, one of the most convincing pieces of evidence is the fact that the astrological correlations that have turned up in these various analyses disappear with people who have had induced births.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you have any opinions to offer about the increasing prevalence of induced birth and its impact on this field, aside from making research harder.
It makes research enormously difficult. The Gauquelins had a couple of hypotheses about what was actually going on here. I think they would call this one the astrological midwife. In other words, it's not being born with particular configurations that cause things, but that you have a propensity, a genetic propensity to be born at a particular astrological configuration. So if the birth is induced, you don't see the accurate chart, and that would get back to the rectification that Steve was asking about in the previous question. It does make the research virtually impossible to do if you're using natal astrology, with 40% of the births being induced in the US. Poor recording of the birth times, and then the new privacy restrictions makes it virtually impossible to get data. So the Gauquelins were able to just go into the records in Europe in the 50s and obtain these data without any hassle. You could no longer go get birth data like that. Yes, sir.
Yes. Has there been any attempt to correlate these data with the moment of conception? Because that would seem a more accurate criterion. You could get certain genetic changes, whereas the moment of birth, nothing much happens. It would seem irrelevant, but obviously the two are related to a certain extent.
Certainly. Timing the moment of conception would probably be more challenging than timing the moment of birth. We could probably time the day of conception pretty well, but assuming conception is when you actually have the sperm fertilizing the egg, that event isn't always concurrent with the event that caused that, so.
Thanks so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Ingo Swann had written an unpublished manuscript about mass murderers, that their astrological charts actually lined up pretty closely. And he had transparent plastic sheets that showed their different charts, and you could lay them on top of each other. He did 70, and the problem, he said, was trying to find the true birth time of these criminals.
Certainly. Well, the true birth times always are a challenge, and then again, you still have this issue of expected frequencies. So, you know, how many, at any particular time, how many other non-mass murderers are born, and there's a number of other challenges that you have here. But this would be another example, potentially, of an eminent professional, maybe not the kind of eminence of a profession that you might be interested in, but that's an interesting thought. I'm not familiar with that specific work, though. Oh, a little closer.
Hello.
Thank you.
Good. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Okay. So according to sidereal time, when our planet is aligned with the galactic center, psi abilities are enhanced by like 4 times according to experimentation. So I was wondering if there's any research done between people being born when we're aligned with the galactic center and psi abilities.
I'm not aware of it. That would be relatively straightforward to do. If you have the birth time, that's another point that you can calculate. So that would be straightforward to do. I'm not aware of that, though.
Cool, thanks.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.